The smell hit her first, the way it always did. A layered perfume of old leather, engine oil, and the faint sweet scent of the pine-scented air freshener her father had hung from the rearview mirror a decade ago. It was the smell of the garage, but more than that, it was the smell of him. Clara pulled the string for the single overhead bulb, and the light flickered on, casting a golden glow over the curves of the 1967 Ford Mustang. It was a deep Highland green, polished to a shine that reflected her own troubled face back at her. The car wasn't just a car. It was the last, tangible piece of her father. He had bought it as a rusting shell when she was 10 and spent the next 7 years rebuilding it. Some of her most vivid childhood memories were of handing him wrenches, her small hands struggling to grip the cold steel, or sitting on a stool watching him patiently reassemble the engine, piece by glorious piece. He called it the Green Hornet, and on Saturday mornings he would take her for drives through the winding country roads, the windows down and the radio playing his favorite oldies. He'd taught her to drive in it, his hand steady on the gear shift beside hers, his voice a calm and reassuring rumble above the engine's purr. Now, it sat in silence. It had been nearly a year since he'd passed, and the silence he'd left behind was a constant, aching presence. The car was a monument to him, a four-wheeled memorial of steel and chrome, but monuments didn't pay the bills. Clara leaned against the workbench, her gaze drifting from the car to the stack of envelopes on the corner of the bench. A final notice for the electricity. A letter from the bank about the mortgage, written in language that was polite but firm. A bill from the roofer who had fixed the leak after the last winter storm. A bill she had been avoiding for 3 months. The numbers swam in her head, a rising tide of debt that threatened to pull her under. She had a decent job as a librarian, but it was quiet and steady, not lucrative. It was enough to live on, but not enough to handle the avalanche of expenses that had come with inheriting an old house and a life left behind. Selling the Mustang would solve everything. Instantly. A collector had already made her an offer 2 months ago, a number so high it had made her dizzy. It was enough to clear her debts, fix the aging plumbing, and even create a small cushion for the future. It was the logical, sensible thing to do. Her father, a practical man in all other aspects of his life, would have likely told her to sell it himself. "It's just metal, Clara," he would have said. "Your future is more important." But she could still feel the phantom grip of his hand on her shoulder. She could still hear his laughter as they'd sped down an open highway. This car was where his ghost lived, and selling it felt like an eviction. It felt like the final goodbye, the one she still hadn't been able to say. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her reverie. It was a text from her cousin, Mark. "Hey, you coming to Aunt Carol's on Sunday? We need to talk about Grandpa's estate." Clara sighed. That was the other storm cloud on the horizon. Her grandfather had passed away 2 years before her father, and the family had been dragging their feet on settling his modest estate. It mostly consisted of his small house, which had finally sold. Now it was a matter of dividing the proceeds. A meeting had been called, a summons for the remaining family to gather and divide the spoils. She knew Mark was particularly eager. He'd been talking about a business opportunity for months, one that required a sudden injection of capital. She typed back a simple reply. "Yes, I'll be there." She switched off the garage light, the darkness swallowing the Mustang whole. As she walked back into the house, the scent of oil and pine faded, replaced by the sterile, lonely smell of her quiet kitchen. She looked at the stack of bills, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. The sensible thing to do, the logical choice. But logic had nothing to do with the feeling of her father's hand in hers, the rumble of the engine a shared heartbeat between them. Sunday arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum, threatening a rain that never came. Aunt Carol's house smelled of roasted chicken and potpourri, a cloying combination that clung to the heavy floral curtains and the doilies protecting every wooden surface. The air was thick with forced pleasantries. Clara kissed her aunt's powdery cheek and accepted a glass of lukewarm iced tea. The rest of the family was already there. Her Uncle Robert, looking bored, and his 2 grown children who were engrossed in their phones. And then there was Mark, who detached himself from a conversation and moved toward her with the predatory grace of a salesman sensing a commission. "Clara, so glad you could make it," he said, his smile a little too wide. He was dressed in a crisp polo shirt and chinos, looking like he had just stepped off a golf course. "How are you holding up? It's been a tough year, I know." His concern felt manufactured, a box to be checked. "I'm managing, Mark." "Thanks," she replied, her tone polite but cool. Good, good. That's what I like to hear. Resilience. It's in our blood," he said, patting her arm. "Listen, after we eat, we should all sit down and figure out the last of Grandpa's affairs. It's time to close that chapter, for everyone's sake. He glanced around the room, as if to make sure everyone was a witness to his responsible nature. The meal was a stilted affair. The conversation danced around any topic of substance, sticking to safe, shallow subjects like the weather and a recent town scandal involving the mayor's son. Clara mostly listened, picking at her food. She felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if she were watching a play in a language she barely understood. These people were her family, but her father had been the bridge connecting her to them. Without him, she was an island. After the plates were cleared and a bland dessert was served, Mark cleared his throat, tapping a fork against his water glass. "All right, everyone, if I can have your attention." He pulled a folder from his briefcase. "As you know, Grandpa's house has been sold, and after all fees and taxes, the final amount to be divided among the four of us," he nodded toward his father, Aunt Carol, and then Clara, who was inheriting her father's share, "is $120,000. So, $30,000 each." Aunt Carol clasped her hands. "Oh, that's wonderful. A nice little nest egg." Mark smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It is. And I, for one, have a plan for it. I'm on the ground floor of a fantastic tech startup, Green Energy Solutions. It's the future. My $30,000 is my initial investment, but to really secure my position, I need a little more." Clara felt a familiar knot tighten in her stomach. She knew where this was going. She'd seen Mark's fantastic opportunities before. They usually ended with him asking family for a loan. He turned his gaze to her, his expression shifting into one of practiced sympathy. "Clara, I know things have been tight for you. Dad told me you had to get the roof fixed, and that big old house of yours must cost a fortune to maintain." He let the words hang in the air, a public airing of her private struggles. She felt her cheeks flush with heat. She set her jaw. "I'm doing okay." Of course you are," he said smoothly, dismissing her pride with a wave of his hand. "But you shouldn't have to just do okay. You're sitting on a solution to all your problems. A beautiful solution." He leaned forward, his voice dropping as if sharing a secret. "That old car, the Mustang." The room went quiet. Clara could feel everyone's eyes on her. "I was talking to a guy I know, a classic car broker. He said a '67 Mustang in good condition could easily fetch $80,000, maybe even $90,000. Imagine that, Clara. All your debts gone. Money in the bank, you'd be free." He smiled, triumphant, as if he had just handed her a winning lottery ticket. "You should sell your car, it's just a thing." The words hit her with a physical force. It's just a thing. He had no idea. He saw a price tag, an asset, a number on a ledger. He didn't see the scraped knuckles, the late nights in the garage, the smell of oil and pine, or a father's proud smile. He didn't see the last piece of a man's soul, lovingly polished and preserved. In that moment, all her grief, her stress, and her quiet desperation curdled into a cold, hard rage. The silence in Aunt Carol's dining room stretched thin, fragile as old lace. Clara could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, each tick a hammer blow against the quiet. Everyone was looking at her, waiting. Mark's smile remained plastered on his face, an unnerving mask of self-satisfaction. He genuinely believed he had offered her salvation, a simple, logical solution that she, in her grief-addled state, had simply failed to see. He had reduced her father's legacy to a line item, a quick fix for her messy, inconvenient life. "It's just a thing." Clara looked down at her hands, resting on the table. They were trembling, not from weakness, but from a surge of adrenaline. She thought of her father's hands, calloused, often smudged with grease, but always so gentle. The hands that had built an engine, held her own when she was small, and waved a final frail goodbye from a hospital bed. That car was the last thing those hands had built with love. She lifted her gaze, meeting Mark's directly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it was clear and sharp as shattered glass. "So is your inheritance." The words landed with the force of a slap. Mark's smile vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed confusion. What did you say?" Aunt Carol gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Clara, honestly." Uncle Robert, who had been on the verge of sleep, sat up straight, blinking. "Now let's not get heated." But Clara's eyes never left Mark. She felt a strange, liberating calm settle over her. The dam of her restraint had broken. "Your inheritance," she repeated, enunciating each word with chilling precision. "The $30,000 you are so eager to get your hands on. It is also just a thing. It's paper. It's a number in a bank account. It's the result of Grandpa's house being sold. But it has no story. You didn't build it. You didn't love it. You didn't spend years of your life pouring your heart into it. You just waited for it. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping but losing none of its intensity. You talk about my father's car as if it's an inconvenience I'm clinging to. You have no idea what that car is. It's every weekend he spent teaching me the difference between a socket wrench and a spanner. It's the scent of his aftershave in the upholstery. It's the only place I can still go where I can almost feel him sitting next to me, telling me everything is going to be okay. You want me to sell that? To sell him, so you can throw his father's money at another one of your get-rich-quick schemes? Mark's face had turned a blotchy, furious red. That's not fair. This is a legitimate business opportunity, and it's not the same thing at all. You're being overly emotional. Am I? Clara shot back, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. Emotional is all I have left of him. You see a pile of cash. I see a lifetime of memories. You're asking me to erase my father's last chapter for your first draft. The answer is no. She paused, then added the final cutting blow. And frankly, your suggestion is insulting. Without waiting for another response, Clara pushed her chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the wooden floor. She stood up, her movements measured and deliberate. Thank you for lunch, Aunt Carol, she said, her voice now steady and formal. She looked around the table at their stunned faces. She was no longer one of them. The bridge was gone, and she had just set fire to her end of it. She walked out of the dining room, grabbing her purse from the entryway table. She could hear them starting to talk behind her, a frantic, muffled buzz of indignation and shock. Mark's voice rose above the others, sharp and angry. She didn't care. She opened the front door, and the cool, damp air felt like a blessing on her flushed skin. As she walked to her own sensible, uninteresting sedan parked at the curb, she felt not regret, but a profound and searing clarity. She might be in debt, and she might be alone, but she was not for sale. The drive home was a blur of gray streets and indifferent traffic lights. The scene from her aunt's dining room played on a loop in Clara's mind, each detail sharp and vivid. Mark's shocked face, the flicker of anger in his eyes, her aunt's scandalized gasp, the heavy, disapproving silence of the room. A part of her, the part that had been raised to be polite and avoid confrontation, was horrified. She had caused a scene. She had spoken with a brutality she didn't know she possessed. She had, in no uncertain terms, chosen a car over her family. But a deeper, stronger part of her felt a fierce, burning pride. For the first time in a year, she had done more than just survive. She had fought back. She had defended her father's memory against the crass opportunism of her cousin. Mark's words, "It's just a thing," echoed in her ears, and she knew with absolute certainty that she had done the right thing. He saw the world in terms of transactions, of gains and losses. He couldn't comprehend that some things, the most important things, had a value that couldn't be quantified. Love, memory, legacy, these were not assets to be liquidated. When she pulled into her own driveway, the house looked darker than usual, its windows like vacant eyes. The loneliness she had been holding at bay for so long washed over her. The confrontation had severed a cord, and while the connection had been frayed and unsatisfying, it had been a connection nonetheless. Now, she was truly on her own. The stack of bills on the kitchen counter seemed to have grown taller in her absence. The final notice for the electricity was now a glaring red. The bank's letter felt heavier, its polite words masking a threat she could no longer ignore. For a moment, panic seized her. Had she made a terrible mistake? Was her pride going to cost her the very home her father had left her? She could have just said no politely. She could have deflected, delayed, promised to think about it. But Mark had pushed her, publicly shamed her for her financial struggles, and tried to turn her grief into his leverage. The thought reignited the fire in her veins. A polite no would not have been enough. He would have kept pushing, calling, wearing her down until she relented. She had needed to build a wall, not just close a door. Her phone buzzed, and her heart jumped. It was a text from Mark. She almost ignored it, but her curiosity won. "You're a selfish fool, Clara. Dad always said you were too sentimental for your own good. When the bank takes your house, don't come crying to us. You'll have that piece of junk to keep you warm." The cruelty of it stung, but it also clarified everything. This wasn't about concern for her well-being. It was about his own frustrated desires. He wasn't trying to help her. He was trying to use her. She deleted the message without replying. He and his opinions no longer had any power over her. Clara walked through the quiet house and out into the garage, flipping on the familiar light. There it was, the Green Hornet. It didn't look like a piece of junk. It looked like a promise. It was her inheritance, far more valuable than the $30,000 she had just effectively refused. That money was the product of a death and a sale. The car was the product of a life and a passion. She ran a hand along its cool, smooth fender. The rage and the panic began to subside, replaced by a quiet resolve. Selling the car had always been presented as the only solution, the easy way out. But she was her father's daughter. He had never looked for the easy way. He had seen a rusted-out wreck and envisioned a masterpiece. He had put in the hours, done the hard work, and brought something beautiful back to life with his own two hands. She would not sell the car, but she wouldn't let it be the reason she lost everything else, either. It would not be a monument that dragged her under. It would be her inspiration. She would find another way. She would call the bank and ask about restructuring the mortgage. She would pick up extra hours at the library, maybe even find a second part-time job. She would create a budget so strict it squeaked. It would be hard. It would be a struggle. But it would be her struggle, and the choice would be hers. The car was not her problem. It was the symbol of her strength. It was a reminder that the best things in life are not things at all, but the love and labor we pour into them. The days that followed were a testament to quiet, grinding determination. Clara woke up each morning before dawn, the house cold and silent around her, and sat at her kitchen table with a calculator and a notepad. She mapped out every penny of her income and every dollar of her debt. The numbers were grim, a relentless army marching against her. But for the first time, she felt like a general, not a victim. She drew lines, circled figures, and created a battle plan. Her first call was to the bank. Her voice trembled as she explained her situation to a faceless customer service representative. She expected impatience, a cold recitation of policy. Instead, she found a patient woman who walked her through the process of applying for a loan modification, explaining the necessary paperwork and the potential outcomes. There were no guarantees, but for the first time, the mortgage felt less like a guillotine and more like a mountain she might actually be able to climb. Next, she took on more hours at the library, staying late to reshelve books and manage inventory until her eyes burned from the fluorescent lights. She started a small side business, using her librarian skills to offer research services to local college students, spending her weekends buried in academic databases. The work was exhausting, and the extra income was a trickle, not a flood, but it was something. It was hers. She sold old furniture, canceled subscriptions, and learned to cook meals that were nourishing but astonishingly cheap. Her life shrank, becoming a narrow channel of work and sleep, but within that channel she felt a growing sense of power. Throughout it all, the Mustang sat in the garage, a silent partner in her struggle. Some nights, bone-weary and discouraged, she would go out and just sit in the driver's seat, her hand resting on the steering wheel her father's hands had held. The smell of leather and oil was a balm to her frayed nerves. The car wasn't a burden, it was her sanctuary. It reminded her what she was fighting for. Not just a house, but the right to protect a legacy. One Saturday afternoon, after a particularly grueling week, she decided the car needed more than just a polish. A rattling sound had started near the front passenger side, a sound she had been trying to ignore. In the past, she would have called a mechanic. But now, the thought of the expense made her flinch. More than that, she felt a new, insistent urge. Her father had taught her the basics. He had always wanted her to know how the car worked, just in case. This was the case. She found his old, grease-stained manuals on a shelf and pulled out his heavy steel toolbox. She spent hours poring over diagrams, her brow furrowed in concentration. The work was slow and frustrating. She got grime under her fingernails and a streak of oil on her cheek. At one point, trying to get a better look under the dashboard, she had to contort herself into a position that made her back scream in protest. As she lay on the floor, looking up into the complicated tangle of wires, her hand brushed against a piece of the carpeted paneling that felt loose. Curious, she tugged at it. It came away in her hand, revealing not just wiring but a small recessed space in the car's frame, a space that shouldn't have been there. Tucked inside was a small flat metal box, the kind used for fishing lures or first aid kits. It was cool to the touch. Her heart began to pound a heavy, frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had cleaned the car hundreds of times, but she had never known this was here. With trembling hands, she pulled the box out and opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded cotton, was a bundle of old savings bonds, held together by a rubber band and a single folded envelope, with her name written on it in her father's familiar, blocky handwriting. She opened the letter first, her vision blurring with tears before she even started reading. "My dearest Clara, if you're reading this, it means you found my little secret. I hope you found it because you were tinkering with the engine, not because you were tearing the car apart to sell it. This old Hornet has been my pride and joy. But you, my girl, You have always been my life. I know I'm not going to be around forever, and I worry about you. This world can be a hard place. I saved a little bit here and there over the years. It's not a fortune, but I hoped it might be enough to help you out of a tight spot someday, or maybe give you a down payment on a place of your own. Use it for your future, Clara. Don't let my memories become your burden. Live your life. Be happy. But if you can, keep the car. Not for me, but for you. Let it be a reminder that even something broken and rusted can be made beautiful again with enough love and hard work. Just like people. All my love. Dad. Clara sat there on the cold concrete floor of the garage, the letter clutched in her hand, and wept. She cried for her father, for the love and foresight he had packed into this hidden box. She cried for the lonely, difficult months she had endured. And she cried with a sense of relief so profound it was almost painful. The bonds, when she counted them, amounted to just over $25,000. It wasn't a life-changing fortune. It wasn't the 90,000 mark had dangled in front of her. But it was enough. It was more than enough. It was a lifeline, thrown to her from the past. The following Monday, Clara walked into the bank not with an application for a modification, but with a check that cleared her mortgage arrears and paid the roofer in full. She paid the electric bill. She bought groceries without looking at the prices. That evening, she didn't work. Instead, she took the keys to the Mustang, opened the garage door, and started the engine. The familiar rumble filled the air, a deep and steady heartbeat. She drove out of the city, toward the winding country roads where her father had taught her to drive. With the windows down and the cool night air on her face, she was not just driving a car. She was steering her own life. The Mustang was no longer a monument to a past she couldn't let go of. It was a testament to a love that had never left her and a symbol of her own resilience. It was not just a thing. It was a part of her story. A story of struggle, of love, and of the quiet triumph of finding her own way forward. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a message of hope. Sometimes the things we fight to keep are the very things that end up saving us, not because of their monetary value, but because of the love they represent and the strength they inspire within us.